here.
Okay, so could you talk about how your experience in London shaped your decision to form St. Ambrose?
And can you start with just your name, just in case I'm not the person to edit the video?
Yeah, okay.
Really simple.
My name is Vincent Quayle, and I started St. Ambrose. We didn't call it that at the time, really back in '68. In '72, I heard about a group in London called Shelter Housing Aid Center, it might have been called, and now I think it's just called Shelter. And I went over and I spent 2 weeks with them, with the folks at Shelter, and I lived there. I was a priest at the time. I had been in the Jesuits for 20 years, and I heard it was a teaching model for housing, which is, and we in the Jesuits were trained to be teachers, so I went over and studied it and lived with the folks out there, and I took 3 of the beautiful women out for dinner on 3 different nights and said mass for the old guys, and who found it refreshing to see an American come in and ad-lib the mass, you know. So then I decided I would use this model, which is even why we call it the St. Ambrose Housing Aid Center. And we called it St. Ambrose after a large African-American parish over in northwest Baltimore, because we knew we would be working mostly with minority folks, and that, you know, black folks in particular have a lot of confidence in the church, and so we decided we would call it after a big parish church, the Housing Aid Center, and it was built on a teaching model where we would teach people how to buy houses, because in those days there was terrific discrimination. Black families could not get mortgages through the banks and savings and loans, and we decided we were going to change that. And then we would also teach the banks and savings and loans using perhaps more activist modes like picketing and raising hell and stuff like that. So that's where it all began. And I've never been back to Shelter, but you know, when I look at St. Ambrose today, what I saw at Shelter in 1972, St. Ambrose looks just like it. We developed similar programs to what they did: default mortgage counseling, home ownership counseling, housing development, a rental program. The only thing we didn't develop, which they had, which I wanted to do, was a special program for prisoners coming out of prison to help them find decent housing. And I always wanted to do that, but we never quite got around to it, doing it. So.
So why did you start St. Ambrose in Baltimore?
Well, I had been in Africa. I was part of my training in the Jesuits was to go overseas or to teach in one of the Jesuit schools, like Loyola has Loyola High School and Loyola College, and Jesuits in America do mostly educational work, and they had Fordham and Georgetown and lots of the big universities. And I was sent as a part of my training over to Nigeria, where the Jesuits were starting a school out in the bush. And so I was there. I was supposed to be there for 2 years, but a war broke out called the Biafran War in eastern Nigeria. It was the Igbo tribe, which was the tribe that I was working with. They were Christians. Southern Nigeria was Christian. It was the west part was Protestant, the east part was Catholic, and then the north was Muslim. And we're seeing some of the same problems in Nigeria today up in the north with the Muslims and the Boko Haram and all. But a war broke out, and the Igbos were a marvelous people. They were absolutely marvelous people. They called themselves the Jews of Africa because they were the best. And I said, no, you're the Greeks of Africa because you have to tell everybody else that you're the best, and it's going to get you in trouble. It did. So they would tell everybody else they were the best. And the Muslims up north didn't want to hear that because they didn't have educations. The Christians in the south, they took to the Christian schools. That's was really attracted why they brought the missionaries and the teachers in from Europe and wherever. And so they would get the best jobs. They would go up to the north. The Igbos would go up, they'd take over the electricity, the telecommunications, all communications. They would take over the best jobs, and they would live in little ghettos, but they would brag about it to the Muslims, and the Muslims got fed up, so they did a pogrom for a week or so, and they slaughtered a lot of the Igbos. They came back, and I went down and greeted them at the train station and tried to get them to the hospitals and things. But then a war broke out, a civil war between the South and the North, and I had to leave. And I left, had to escape through the Cameroons, came back, and my superiors sent me to Woodstock, Maryland, which the Jesuits had their Theologate Seminary. And I went there, and the country had when you're out of the country for a while, you're not talking with your friends. You're not reading the books they're reading or the articles. And you come back and you have a bit of an inferiority complex. And I didn't know what I was going to do. So the first summer back, I went out to Chicago, and I studied to be a community organizer, the same program that Obama, our president, studied under, and became a community organizer, and came back and found the same problems in Baltimore, in the neighborhoods, in housing especially, that I had worked on in Chicago. And it led to my starting the St Ambrose Housing Aid Center. Was that your question?
What were those problems that you saw?
Well, the biggest one was there were two systems of housing, one for whites and one for black folks. Because we didn't have a strong, large Hispanic community at that time. This is in '68. So white folks, if they wanted to buy a house, they'd hire a realtor, they'd go out and they'd find a house, they'd go to a savings and loan or a commercial bank, and they'd get their mortgage. Well, black folks couldn't, the banks wouldn't lend to black folks in those days. Savings and loans wouldn't lend to them. And so another cadre of I don't want to call them crooks, because they would argue that no, they were making a buck, but they were really the only ones helping black folks in those days. But the black folks were not being treated right. The white folks, the old white folks, were having their homes stolen from them, which was contributing to the tension in the neighborhoods, the racial tension in the city. And historically, if we go back and look at where a lot of our problems began, or what contributed to them, this was one of the major problems. That, the whites would have white people would have their homes stolen from them from a group called blockbusters in those days, and they would go in and frighten the old white people, steal their homes, and then go into the black community and charge them too much, and say to the black folks, you have a wonderful home for you. And it's a mostly white neighborhood, but you'll be treated well, when there have been no incidents or anything like that. So it was just a bad system. It was just a corrupt system. And in the early years, we thought the problem was the blockbusters. And it was only in a couple of years later we realized, well, the real problem was the banks weren't lending, and the savings and loans weren't lending to black families. So that's when I heard about London and decided to go over and see they had similar problems, and came back and we started picketing the bad guys who weren't lending. And we brought about, looking back over 50 years, I think we probably did more good in those early years than we have in all the time since. Not all the time since, but a lot of it. Anyway, that's how it got started.
Thank you.
So then what was it like to be part of the Baltimore civil rights movement back then?
Baltimore had we had the national figures, Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy and John Kennedy, but then we had some wonderful civil rights leaders in Baltimore in those days. The two that come to mind, and they worked with St Ambrose. They were on my board of directors and advised us. Walter Carter was one, and Sampson Green was the other one. And they kind of adopted us. they had a group called the Activists, which was an activist group that would do a lot of picketing and demonstration, and they adopted us. I used to go out and give my preach to them about what we saw as the problems in housing. And then Parent Mitchell was a big figure in the civil rights movement here in Baltimore, and Clarence Mitchell, who the courthouse is named after. He was a big figure. There was a really strong civil rights movement at the time, or a growing civil rights. I don't know how strong it was, but it was a nascent civil rights movement. And I felt we were kind of part of that. You know, we didn't articulate it that way at the time, but looking back, the 60s was a wonderful period in the history of the country. I mean, it was in turmoil in many ways, and because of the civil rights movement and then the assassinations. But it was also a time of great activity, and we young people, was young, relatively young in those days, we thought we could change the world. And we were convinced we were going to change the world. So it was exciting. I mean, that's when a lot of the seminarians and nuns left the convent and the seminary to go out and work in the neighborhoods. And that's where I met my wife. She came to work for St Ambrose for 1 year, and 5 years later we were married. So it was just an exciting time to be in the city. And it was a hopeful time, you know, and looking back, you know, I thought we would have solved all our problems by now. You know, I thought if black families could own their homes the way white families do, the neighborhoods would be safe, the schools would be good, the streets would be clean, there'd be little crime. And we didn't anticipate, and there was a senator, Daniel Moynihan, who said, we didn't anticipate the breakup of the family, initially and mostly, you know, to start in the black community, be it now more and more in the white community as well. And we didn't anticipate what drugs were going to do to our society. They were the two huge forces out there that nothing else seemed to make a whole lot of difference, that a lot of the actions and excitement that was going on. So that's pretty much and that's what allowed me to attract a lot of active young people to come to St. Ambrose. We had a lot of good people who were motivated. They just didn't want a job. They wanted to do something with their lives, you know, and really make a difference. And that was really our strength at the time.
So I have a follow-up question about, so people don't think of housing and civil rights normally as going together. Can you talk a little bit about how you see, what was that connection?
Well, it was very clear to me, I'll tell you that. I saw that the inequality of housing and the inability of black families to buy their own homes and own their homes, it was affecting, they became tenants in the neighborhoods for the most part. Now this isn't true of the wealthy upper middle class black neighborhoods, they were fine. But in the ordinary neighborhoods where working class whites lived, and you know, we could see a lot of that in Baltimore and the different neighborhoods, the damage that was done by the loss of home ownership. I mean, at night, the old white folks would sit around the table with their children and talk about having lost their home. And who did they blame? They didn't blame the blockbusters. They blamed black folks for stealing their homes. So it was a real civil war. To me, it was a civil war. The black folks were denied the right to own their own home in an equitable way with white folks. And the cost to our society and our neighborhoods was tremendous, absolutely tremendous.
And how does that effect show up today? Like, what's the...
Well, we've seen a lot of progress. There's no question we've seen a great deal of progress. The banks, and it was done legislatively, but it was also done there were 5 banks who controlled Baltimore in those days. There were 2 large savings and loans, Loyola Federal, Baltimore Federal, First National Building and Loan, and then Equitable Trust, and some more of the commercial banks. Savings Bank of Baltimore was the big mortgage lender in town, or one of the big ones as a savings bank. That's all they did was make mortgage loans. Well, and this is where we were somewhat successful. They came together after we were picketing them, and they decided to go and set up a program to help black folks get mortgages from their banks and savings and loans. And they went to the governor, I don't remember who it was at the time, and they got the governor in the state of Maryland to institute a program called the Maryland Housing Fund, which was an insurance program for the banks. It protected the banks in lending money to lower income people. And it was like what we know as the FHA today, which was discriminating in its own right in those days. And the Maryland Housing Fund insured 35,000 home loans in a period of like 10 or 15 years. And it was all the neighborhoods like Northwood and Randallstown and all the neighborhoods that black folks were trying to move into in those days. And now that they could get loans, those neighborhoods are much healthier, and they are much healthier today than the neighborhoods that we see in East Baltimore and West Baltimore, the neighborhoods we're reading all the time about the problems that exist down there, where home ownership was just lost. And home ownership was important from a number of point of views. For me, I always looked at it mostly as a neighborhood stabilization program, that for neighborhoods to be healthy, people had to, for the most part, own their homes. But it was also the beginning of the creation of wealth for families. If families owned their homes, they would pass the equity in the home onto their kids. And they would keep the home, and that was particularly true in the black community. Black folks wouldn't sell their homes, they'd pass them on to their children, you know? And that was, and then it gave the folks the money to send their kids to college and to do all those other things that money is important to, and also to have decent retirements. So yeah, it was all tied in, it was all wound up.
And how would you compare the climate of the 60s to the racial tensions and Baltimore Uprising today?
Well, clearly the tensions were there. I mean, we had the riots, and I forget the years where we had the riots, but there were terrific riots here in the city where, and one of the big effects of that was white folks just gave up on the city and they moved out to so it was a big growth. And a lot of black families, middle-class families, decided, that's why we have Columbia in Maryland. The black middle-class folks said, we're not tolerating this stuff anymore, we're going out there. And today, well, if you want me to be, can I be honest? Today, the low-income people, the working class, well, the big issue is probably the loss of jobs in Maryland, in the steel factories, in the manufacturing jobs. And this isn't just Baltimore, this is all over the country when we look at the cities and where the minorities are and trying to make it and get decent jobs. So that would be, that's probably a lot bigger than what I'm going to say, but we lost the leadership. The black community lost its leadership. And I think, you know, as I look back over my 50 years, that to me is the biggest failing that I have seen in the black community. I mean, who do we have? We have Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton, for God's sake, as national leaders who are up after every incident that happens. They're up there on television. We don't have the folks that we had in those days who had the vision and had the optimism and could instill hope in people to work harder and do things. Now we see beginnings of it now in the tension between the police department and the black community or the low-income black community. So, there's you always have hope. And there's been a tremendous amount of progress. I mean, we want to forget that sometimes in light of the troubles that we see, especially in the media these days and on the streets these days. But the suburbs, there's a huge black middle class out there now that wasn't there back then in those days. It was just beginning in the 60s. And that's all very hopeful. But for the folks who have been left behind, life hasn't... Oh, and then the other thing is the single moms. We, in Baltimore City, 90% of black children are brought to single moms. Now, how does a society cope with that, 90% are born to single moms. What a burden on those women and on the grandparents of those families. The grandparents wind up raising the kids or trying to raise the kids. So those two problems, the lack of leadership and the loss of fatherhood, with all its joys and responsibilities, has had a tremendous impact on those families who haven't made it. In Baltimore, we know it mostly in the lower income neighborhoods in East Baltimore and West Baltimore, more and more in Northwest Baltimore. But those to me are the two biggest forces that, again, we didn't anticipate. When I came to town here, most black families, the men were married, they raised their kids, they had jobs in the, good blue collar jobs. And the families were together. I don't see that today. It's hard. I don't have my activism anymore. It's hard for me to get angry and to go do things. I feel I'm tired. I made my little contribution. I have my beautiful grandchildren up there now that I'm trying to save for their college education. Of course, white folks are hurting badly today too. I had my hair cut the other day, not because of you coming, but I had my hair cut. And I said to the barber, which is one of my lines all the time now, like my staff, I'll come back to that, but I said to the barber, are you able to put money away for retirement? He said, no. He said, we can't save a nickel. He said, we only have one child, my wife and I, but we spend every dollar we make and on food, on education, on health, and all that, and we're not able to save. And one of my greatest failings at St Ambrose was not doing enough for the retirement program for our staff at St Ambrose. In the last years we tried to change that a little bit and make a difference and help folks, but working class folks today have no idea what they're going to need in retirement. It's extraordinary. Pat and I are okay because she had a good job in a law firm as a paralegal. But I put away what I could, knowing that it was going to become an issue someday. But ordinary folks, they just live paycheck to paycheck, and they just don't have the money. And in your profession, you're experiencing that yourselves, probably.
So if you had started St. Ambrose today, what else would you do differently?
Well, the motivation for starting it was different in those days because the injustice was so obvious. I mean, the bankers couldn't argue with us. Loyola Federal was a $1 billion operation, which was a lot of money in those days. And in '72, when we did the research before we went out and picketed Loyola, they had made $20 million of loans to Ocean City, Maryland, for second homes for families. They had made a total of 14 loans in the whole city of Baltimore for a total of $400 and something thousand. So we had them with their pants down. They had no excuse. And it was so clear, and the media picked it up. And we had a strong media in those days too, I canceled my subscription to the Baltimore Sun 4 or 5 years ago because I don't follow sports. And it's a sports newspaper. The Baltimore Sun has become a sports paper. And ads, I don't need a hearing aid, I don't think. And windows, we have windows, I don't need windows. So there's just nothing that I'm interested in reading. I read the New York Times faithfully every day. It takes up too much of my time. And I get the Wall Street Journal. I have this here just to find out what the other people are thinking. Although it's pretty boring after a while. I don't really read it. But the Times is the only thing that I really find illuminating. And David Brooks should be our next president, for God's sake. He's a writer for the Times. The guy is a wise person. And the Sun, they don't have the money, I guess, to hire the staff of reporters and investigative reporters. And in the 60s, we had all that. And the Sun, and we had the News American, and we had the Evening Sun. And those papers, they had the money and the staff to produce good media attention and insights and information, which allowed ordinary people to figure out what was going on out there. We don't have that today, and commercial television is an absolute disaster. Thank God we have PBS and BBC, because they're the only stations I like watching, except for the old movies and some old British movies. I enjoy watching them. But the rest of television is just an absolute disgrace.
So I have kind of a basic question. So I know part of what you did at St Ambrose was fight the banks. What were the other programs that you initiated?
Well, when we got the banks lending money, and they realized, gee, we can make money lending money. These are not bad families, for God's sake. I used to put my Roman collar on and take a family down to Baltimore Federal or Loyola Federal and say, listen, this guy works at Bethlehem Steel. His wife is a school teacher. They deserve a loan from you, not from the crooks out there, but from you. And it became clear. So then a couple of years later, the banks came to St Ambrose and said, listen, we need your help. We have families who fall behind on their mortgage, and we don't want to foreclose on them, but they lost their telephone, and we can't get in touch with them. And I said, well, we'll work on that. Let us know who the families are, and we'll go out and we'll visit the families and tell them that you don't want to foreclose, and we'll help them save their homes. So that was the second big program we started. Then we thought we could rebuild the inner city, so we got into rental housing and in some of the tough neighborhoods in East Baltimore and West Baltimore, and we built. And our philosophy in those days, we would take what we thought was one of the strongest institutions in the neighborhood, which was really the Catholic Church, especially if it had a school. It was kind of an anchor for the neighborhood. And so we would go in there, and we would start to work on housing issues and build rental housing and housing for seniors and stuff like that. And we did that for a number of years. But then the Catholic Church fell apart. The priests had left. People didn't go to church anymore. A lot of people didn't go to church, which meant the money wasn't coming in to support it. And a lot of the middle-class Catholics moved to the suburbs. And so that became a big problem there. And then when the vacant house issue broke, 15, 20 years ago, we decided, well, let's see if we can't have an impact on vacant houses. And we started a program. And for a little group, we buy and renovate 50 houses a year and renovate them beautifully and sell them to new homeowners and stuff like that. And David Sand runs that program, and he's done a marvelous job at St Ambrose. And then we had an insight in the late 70s that Baltimore doesn't have a housing shortage. Everyone's talking about a housing shortage in those days. And Baltimore once had close to 1 million people. And the population fell down to 600,000. And Baltimore, when it had 1 million, it had 300,000 housing units. When it fell down to 600,000, it still had 300,000 housing units. And we said, there's something different wrong there. And so we examined the housing units, and we found out that something like 40% of three-bedroom houses had only one person living in it. One person living in it, usually an elderly person. So we started this home sharing program to have people share their homes, because old people want to die in place. They want to die in their homes if they can. And yet, some of them were having real problems, struggling, paying the utilities, taxes. I have our local bank. I was in there one day, and I said, what do you notice with the old folks? Because we have a lot of old folks in this neighborhood up in here in Northeast. And the banker said to me, we have this new program to help old people who have equity in their home enter into what's called a reverse mortgage, where instead of they're paying the banks each month, the banks pay them from the equity in their home. And then when they die, the bank will get paid its money back, and the federal government will insure this so the banks aren't going to lose money. So, and the manager said, the old folks come in at the end of the month to see if we can help them. And I find that they're dividing their medicine in half. They can't afford to get it renewed, so they divide the pills in half. They really don't have enough to eat. Their groceries run out, their food stamps run out at the end of the month. And I suggest to them, well, why don't you think about this home equity loan situation, reverse mortgage. And they say, oh no, we have to leave our house to our children. We can't do anything to jeopardize that. So anyway, we did the home sharing program. It's been a very successful program. We made something like 1,500 matches, and they're wonderful matches. I mean, this is what the Sun should be printing stories on, these matches, and old folks are staying in their homes, and they get to meet these younger people, many of whom are graduate students who move in. And they get extra money, and the young folks drive them to their doctors, and they do gardening for them, and they do clean the houses and stuff like that. And it's a wonderful program. I'm sorry, I would love to see it expanded, and I know St Ambrose would too, but all that costs money.
So is there a client who inspired you the most during your time at St Ambrose?
The ones that bake cookies for us, I think. No, we've had some wonderful, we got an award once from a Mrs. Dorsey. It was a plaque. It was a plaque. And it was an award to St. Ambrose for all the good work they do in Baltimore, Loretta Dorsey. It's my favorite award that we ever got at St. Ambrose.
And what was the most heartbreaking thing that you witnessed during your time at St. Ambrose?
That's a good question. What was the most heartbreaking thing? I think the realization that we hadn't solved the problems that we thought we were going to solve. something went wrong, you know, and that maybe we were just naive, too naive in those days. And we didn't have the vision to see some of the largest societal issues that were affecting what we were trying to make an impact on. I think that was the hardest thing, admitting that to myself, which is part of the reason why I'm a homebody. My wife criticizes me because I don't go out and do more things, and I love to read. And my grandchildren, my life is really revolves around them right now, and my church. I'm very faithful to our local Catholic church and school. My grandchildren are going to start it in the fall, and I'm very proud. My 3 sons, they go to church, for God's sake. What young people do that today? You know, the 3 of them, and runs a math department out in California, in Sacramento. The other just got his doctorate in physics. And my second son lives here up the street from us here. And they go to church. And they still have their faith, you know, and inspiration.
And what is the craziest thing that you did in your history for St. Ambrose?
What is the craziest thing that I did? Well, Baltimore would tell you the craziest thing we did was picket the banks in the 70s, and Loyola Federal in 72. And, you know, a part of my parents thought it was crazy too, and maybe it was crazy, but it worked. So, what's the craziest? The saddest thing is that, you know, I didn't put money into the retirement, because we didn't have the money to put in, but still, I could have done more to help folks with their retirement. And the happiest things were seeing some of our staff get married, children marry each other, you know. Stuff like that. So my staff has been my inspiration through all the years. I've just had a great staff. You know, I really didn't have to do anything to be their boss. I just made sure I got good people in who wanted to do something with their lives, and I said, go do it. Let me know what you need, and I'll try to help out and raise the money and do what I can. Karen says, it's the best job she's ever had. And I told her it's the best job you've ever had because you do whatever you want, and I've never told you couldn't do anything. But that worked. That's, you know, if people said, I know nothing about business. I know nothing about housing. But I brought people in, people were attracted to us who did know it, or who were going to learn how to do it, and they did it. And that's my greatest consolation, that we've had this wonderful staff, and now I watch them raise their children, and their children are getting married, and it's exciting.
And what advice would you give to those wanting to affect change in Baltimore housing today?
Well, the best advice I got when I went to Chicago, I worked with a wonderful group. Obama worked with a similar group when he went out there. But I worked with a group, and there was a fellow named Tom Gaudet who ran the program, the office. We were organizing, and at night we'd come back and we'd sit around till 2 or 3 in the morning drinking beer and talking about what we had done and what we need to do better and all that stuff. And I was in the mode of a lot of the other young folks there who would talk about world peace and how we've got to do out this and do that. And when I was leaving to come back here to Baltimore, Gaudet pulled me aside and he said, Quayle, he said, you're a nice guy. He said, but if you don't get over this nonsense you talk about, you're never going to do anything worthwhile in your life. He said, pick out a piece of reality, just a little piece of reality. It doesn't matter. I don't care what it is, he said. Pick it out and just spend all your energy working on that piece and trying to do, and you'll be amazed at what you see you can do with life. I think that's the best advice, and that's the advice I give people when they ask me, do I have any advice for them? And again, I don't care what it is, you know, it could be a teacher, whatever it is, just pick something out that's doable, realizable, specific, not just sitting around talking about global issues.
Great.
Okay, well, those are all the questions that I have.
Yeah.
That was good.
Is there anything else you want to say?
No. Oh yeah, put the air conditioner back on.
No, the lights are really hot.
Do you think do you have enough for the shelter?
Yeah, I was going to say, would it be good to do a direct thank you,
Yes,
maybe?
I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
For shelter?
Yeah.
Yes, if you could say, you know, thank you for the inspiration for
Yeah.
St Ambrose
Sure.
and happy 50th anniversary, and something along those
Okay,
lines.
are we on?
Yeah.
Okay. You know, you asked about shelter and how that has influenced St. Ambrose. You know, aside from seeing what they do out there and the specifics of their program, and what it did for me, I saw how inspired and inspiring they could become. They were mostly volunteers. They were school teachers during the day, and they would give their volunteer time at night to come in and work with the family to help improve their housing situation. And they were just a pure inspiration, and it made it easier when I came back, and even easier when I went out to hustle money and people asked me, what was your vision, what were we going to try to do? I would use the shelter model. I would say, this is what we're going to do. We're going to teach institutions, but we're going to teach individuals. We'll get our credibility from teaching individual families how to buy houses and how to improve their housing situation. And then we're going to raise hell on a larger issue with the institutions that could affect the real change. And I said, that's what Shelter has done for me, or did for me back then, and I'm delighted to see Shelter is going as strong as they're going. Okay?
Yeah.
I think so. What do you think?
Yeah.
That, you know, at my age, you get tired. I get tired after